Before we begin, if you enjoy these BL storytelling videos and want to support the continuation of this channel, you can join my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. YouTube doesn't always make it easy to monetize this kind of content, so Patreon really helps me keep creating these stories. You can find the link in the description and pinned comment. And for those who want story continuations, bonus scenes, early access, and more uncensored 18+ BL content, SpicyTimeBL is where you can find it. The rain was coming down in thick, heavy sheets, beating against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Julian sat in the dim light of the living room, his hand instinctively resting on his right knee. The dull, throbbing ache always came back when the weather turned cold. It was a phantom reminder of a life he used to have, a life before the accident, before the Thorne family swallowed him whole. Suddenly, a large, warm hand clamped over his. Julian flinched, looking up. He hadn't even heard Silas enter the room. Silas Thorne moved like a shadow, silent and imposing. He was dressed in a pristine, dark suit, his tie already loosened, smelling faintly of cold rain and expensive cologne. "Your knee," Silas murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to settle right in Julian's chest. Silas knelt down in front of the chair, his dark eyes entirely unreadable as he gently pried Julian's fingers away from Theaching joint. He replaced Julian's hand with his own, his large, warm palms pressing firmly against the damaged bone, massaging it with a slow, deliberate rhythm. "Not a word now," Silas said softly, sensing that Julian was about to apologize for being awake so late. "Just let me." Julian swallowed hard, his heart doing that strange, painful stutter it always did when Silas was this close. This was the confusing, maddening contradiction of Silas Thorne. To the outside world, Silas was a monster. He was the ruthless heir to the Thorne estate, a man who crushed his competitors without a second thought. But here, in the quiet dark of the penthouse, he was the man kneeling on a hardwood floor just to soothe the ache in Julian's shattered leg. It had been this way for 6 months, ever since Silas's grandmother had passed away. Julian closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the chair as Silas's hands worked their quiet magic. He couldn't help but remember the day his life changed. He had been 20 years old when the crash happened. The accident that took his mother's life and left him trapped in a hospital bed with a ruined knee. His dreams of being a professional dancer crushed beneath twisted metal. The man responsible for the crash was Marcus Thorne, Silas's older brother, a reckless socialite who used his family's money to bury his crimes. But Madame Thorne, Silas's grandmother, hadn't let it go. Julian still remembered the day that elegant, terrifyingly gentle old woman had walked into his hospital room. She had sat by his bed, held his shaking hand, and said, "Don't be afraid, child. Come home with me. I will be your grandmother in the future." And she was. For 4 years, she protected Julian, moving him into the sprawling Thorne estate, giving him a safe place to heal, to find a new path in painting. She was his shield against the toxic, viper-filled Thorne family. But then she passed away, and before her will was even read, before the rest of the family could throw Julian out onto the streets, Silas had stepped in. Silas, who had always watched Julian from afar with dark, brooding eyes. Silas had packed Julian's things, put him in the back of a black car, and brought him to this glass fortress in the center of the city. Julian opened his eyes, looking down at the man still kneeling before him. "Silas," he whispered, his voice slightly raspy. "You're back late." Silas didn't look up immediately. His thumbs continued their slow, rhythmic pressure on Julian's knee. There was business to attend to, unpleasant business. Julian knew what that meant. In the past few months, the Thorne family empire had been quietly imploding. Marcus, the golden child, the eldest young master, was falling apart. Every week, a new scandal broke. First, it was illegal gambling rings, then massive hidden debts, and now whisperings of corporate fraud. The media was having a field day. What the media didn't know, but Julian suspected, was that Silas was the one orchestrating the entire collapse. Silas finally looked up, his gaze locking onto Julian's. There was a dangerous, dark fire in those eyes, a quiet intensity that always made Julian feel like he couldn't breathe. "Forget about him," Silas said quietly, as if reading Julian's mind. "He brought your mother's end upon himself. We just gave it a push. He won't be able to stand anymore. No wonder others are turning their backs on him." Julian felt a shiver run down his spine. "You did it, didn't you? You released the investor relations files from the recent years. You exposed his debts." Silas's jaw tightened. He stood up slowly, towering over Julian. The warmth of his hands left Julian's knee, and suddenly the room felt freezing cold. I told my people to gather the eldest young master's debts and illegal records outside to pile them all up. They kept staring, waiting for my signal. I gave it. Silas took a step closer, crowding Julian into the chair. Be quiet about it, Julian. What I do in the boardroom is none of your business. Your only job is to stay by my side. There it was. The sudden wall of ice. Julian frowned, a wave of frustrated heat rising to his cheeks. It was always like this. Silas would show a flicker of humanity, a touch so tender it broke Julian's heart, and then he would snap back into this cold, commanding dictator. I'm not a pet, Silas, Julian said, his voice trembling slightly. I'm a 24-year-old man. You don't have to shield me from the world. Silas's eyes darkened. He leaned down, placing one hand on the armrest of Julian's chair, bringing his face dangerously close. Julian could feel the warmth of Silas's breath against his lips. The tension between them was a physical, heavy thing. It was this suffocating electric pull that made Julian's skin prickle every time they were in the same room. You never learned to defend against others, Silas muttered, his gaze dropping momentarily to Julian's lips before snapping back up to his eyes. You're always so casual. You smile at the staff, you trust people too easily. You let the light touch you during the day, completely unaware of the shadows waiting to drag you down. Then teach me, Julian fired back, his heart pounding. He didn't shrink away. He met Silas's intense gaze head on. Don't just lock me up in this penthouse. Silas stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the room was so heavy, it felt like the air had been sucked out. For a second, Julian thought Silas might kiss him. The way Silas was looking at him, with this desperate, quiet longing mixed with absolute terror, it made Julian's breath hitch. But instead, Silas suddenly pushed away, turning his back. Go to sleep, Julian, it's late. Julian watched him walk away, disappearing down the long, dark hallway. He sat alone in the rain-battered living room, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for a gust of wind that refused to come. Hey guys, just a quick pause in the story. I just wanted to remind you that if you're enjoying this dynamic and want to support the channel, checking out the SpicyTimeBL Patreon is the best way to do it. It really means the world to me and helps keep these stories coming. Anyway, let's get right back into the tension. The next few weeks were agonizing. The air in the penthouse was thick with unspoken words. Silas was working late every night, dismantling what was left of his brother's reputation. Marcus was officially facing prison time for the illegal records Silas had leaked. The Thorne family was in chaos, but Silas remained untouched, sitting at the top of his glass tower. Julian, meanwhile, felt like a ghost. He spent his days painting in the spare room Silas had converted into a studio, staring out at the city skyline. He had everything he could ever want: food, shelter, expensive art supplies, medical care for his knee. But he didn't have the one thing he actually wanted. He didn't have Silas. Not really. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon. Julian had decided he needed to get out. He needed air. He wanted to visit Madame Thorne's grave. It had been her birthday, and Julian felt an overwhelming ache in his chest, a deep longing for the only person in this family who had ever just loved him simply, without complications. He hadn't told Silas he was leaving. He didn't think he needed to. But the moment he stepped out of the private elevator into the underground parking garage, two of Silas's security men stepped in front of him. I'm sorry, Mr. Vance, the taller one said, his voice polite but firm. Mr. Thorne has requested that you do not leave the premises without his explicit permission and a full security detail. Julian froze. I'm just going to the cemetery. It's Madame Thorne's birthday. We understand, sir, but the situation with Marcus Thorne has made things dangerous. Please return to the penthouse. A wave of hot, suffocating anger washed over Julian. He wasn't a prisoner. Hess spun around, pulling out his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed Silas's private number. It rang twice before Silas answered. Julian, is everything all right? Silas's voice was sharp, immediately on edge. Ju Yuanqing, Silas, what are you doing? Julian snapped, using the old formal name he had heard the grandmother use for Silas when she was angry. What are you crazy about? Your men won't let me leave the building. There was a heavy pause on the line. It's for your safety. Marcus is desperate. He knows you're with me. I won't risk him trying to use you to get to me. I am just trying to visit your grandmother's grave. Julian's voice cracked, echoing slightly in the concrete garage. I just want to see her. I will take you this weekend. Go back upstairs, Julian. No. Julian gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. You brought me to this place after she died, and you explain nothing, nothing. You just leave me here in this glass box. Julian, calm down. I hold back, Silas. I don't ask questions. I stay here like a good little secret because I know you're fighting a war, but I'm human too. Julian was breathing heavily now, tears stinging the corners of his eyes. I really can't guess what you're thinking anymore. I don't know when you will be angry, or when you will treat me so inexplicably gentle again. Why do you want to take care of me? Why did you take me in? Julian, please, go upstairs. I'm coming home. Touch me if you want. Push me away if you want. What do you take me for? Julian's voice broke entirely, a sob tearing from his throat. Am I just your punching bag when you're in a bad mood? Or is it a toy that you can shake and grab whenever you feel like it? Because if I am, just tell me. Break my heart and get it over with, Silas, because I can't do this anymore. He didn't wait for a response. He hung up the phone, turned around, and practically ran back into the elevator, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in his knee. By the time Julian reached the penthouse, he was shaking. He walked straight into the living room, collapsing onto the sofa, pulling his knees to his chest. He buried his face in his arms, the tears finally spilling over. He missed the grandmother. He missed his mother. He felt so entirely, completely lost. Grandma, he whispered into the empty room, his voice rough. I miss you so much. I can't seem to find my way. Can you still take me home? He cried until his chest ached, the sound of the rain outside masking the sound of the front door opening. He didn't know how much time had passed, but suddenly the air in the room shifted. A heavy, quiet presence settled over him. Julian sniffled, slowly lifting his head. Silas was standing there. His suit jacket was gone, his shirt was damp with rain, and his hair was slightly disheveled. He looked completely out of breath, as if he had run all the way from his corporate office. But it was his face that made Julian's breath stop. The cold, unreadable mask was gone, utterly shattered. In its place was a look of such profound, devastating vulnerability that it made Silas look like a completely different man. Silas slowly crossed the room. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of the sofa. And then, the terrifying, ruthless head of the Thorne Empire did something Julian never expected. He dropped to his knees. Right there on the floor. Silas sank down, his long legs folding beneath him. He looked up at Julian, his dark eyes shimmering with an unshed, desperate emotion. Slowly, hesitantly, as if Julian were made of thin glass, Silas reached out. He gently wrapped his large hands around Julian's wrists, pulling Julian's hands away from his tear-stained face. Julian, Silas's voice was a ragged whisper, completely stripped of its usual authority. Look at me, Julian sniffled, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He couldn't look away from the raw intensity in Silas's eyes. You are not a toy, Silas said, every word heavy, laced with a desperate need to be understood. You are not a punching bag. You are the only thing in my life that has ever mattered. Julian let out a shaky breath, his eyes widening. Silas, listen to me, Silas pleaded, his thumbs gently stroking the delicate skin of Julian's wrists, feeling the rapid, nervous pulse there. Do you know why I was so quiet all those years when my grandmother took you in? Do you know why I never spoke to you? Why I only watched from the shadows? Julian shook his head slightly, a tear slipping down his cheek. Silas reached up, his rough fingers brushing the tear away with agonizing tenderness. Because I knew what my family was. I knew the rot inside the Thorne name. Marcus ruined your life. He took your mother, he broke your body, and my family just bought their way out of it. I was disgusted by them. I hated them. Silas's voice hardened for a second, a flash of pure venom crossing his features before it softened again as he looked at Julian. And then I saw you, sitting in that garden with my grandmother, learning to walk again, smiling despite the pain. You were this impossible, beautiful light in the middle of all our darkness. Julian's breath hitched. He could feel the trembling in Silas's hands. Theorization of what Silas was saying was washing over him like a warm tide. I stayed away, Silas continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, emotional whisper, because I knew if I got close to you, Marcus would see it. My father would see it. They would use you to control me. They would break you again just to keep me in line. So I stayed in the dark. I let my grandmother protect you while I went into the company and quietly gathered every piece of dirt, every illegal record, every weapon I needed to destroy them all. Julian stared at him, his mind racing. The investor files, Marcus's debts. I didn't give it a push just for the business, Julian, Silas said, his eyes burning with a fierce, possessive loyalty. I tore my own brother down because of what he did to you. I spent the last 4 years building a cage for him so he could never hurt you again. When my grandmother died, I finally had the power to protect you myself. So I brought you here. I locked you away in this penthouse because the war wasn't over, and I was terrified. I was so terrified that if you stepped out of my sight, they would take you from me." Julian let out a soft, broken sound. He pulled his wrist free from Silas's grip, but he didn't pull away. Instead, his shaking hands reached out, his fingers trembling as they touched the sharp angles of Silas's jaw, sliding up into the damp, dark hair at the nape of Silas's neck. Silas closed his eyes at the touch, letting out a long, shuddering breath, as if he had been starving for this contact for years. He leaned his face into Julian's palm, a quiet gesture of complete submission. "You should have told me," Julian whispered, tears spilling down his cheeks. Again, but this time they weren't tears of anger. "You should have trusted me, You didn't have to carry all of that alone." "I didn't know how," Silas murmured, opening his eyes, looking up at Julian with a mixture of reverence and deep, quiet longing. "I only know how to fight, Julian. I only know how to defend against others. I don't know how to be soft. I don't know how to be the man you deserve." Julian felt his chest ache with a sudden, overwhelming rush of affection. All the anger, all the confusion of the past 6 months completely evaporated. Definitely saw the truth. Silas wasn't a cold, controlling dictator. He was a man who had built a fortress around the person he loved, locking himself outside in the storm just to make sure the walls held. "You're an idiot," Julian breathed, a wet, watery laugh escaping his lips. Silas blinked, surprised. "Julian?" Before Silas could say anything else, Julian slid off the sofa, dropping onto his knees on the floor right in front of Silas. The sudden movement made his bad knee twinge, but he didn't care. He was practically sitting in Silas's lap, their chests almost touching. Silas's hands immediately shot out, hovering nervously around Julian's waist, terrified of hurting him. "Your knee. Careful. You shouldn't." "Shut up, Silas," Julian whispered softly. He leaned in, wrapping his arms securely around Silas's broad shoulders. He pressed his face into the crook of Silas's neck, breathing in the scent of rain, cologne, and just him. Silas went rigid for a split second, completely frozen in shock. But then, with a choked, emotional sound, Silas's arms wrapped around Julian's waist. He pulled Julian flush against his chest, burying his face in Julian's shoulder, holding on to him with a desperate, crushing strength. They stayed like that on the floor for a long time, just holding each other. Thessalon's in the penthouse was no longer cold or heavy. It was warm, filled with the quiet, shared realization that they didn't have to hide anymore. Julian pulled back just slightly, keeping his arms around Silas's neck. He looked into those dark eyes, seeing the walls completely dismantled. "You said I'm the only thing that matters," Julian whispered, his gaze dropping to Silas's lips. "Did you mean it?" Silas's hands slid up from Julian's waist, gently cupping Julian's face. His thumbs traced the high crest of Julian's cheekbones. "More than my own life," Silas answered, his voice barely a breath. The tension that had been building between them for 4 years, simmering in the shadows, finally boiled over. Silas leaned in, closing the distance. The kiss was incredibly gentle at first. A hesitant, questioning press of lips, as if Silas was still terrified that Julian might break or wake up or disappear. But the moment Julian leaned into it, parting his lips slightly and kissing back with all the pent-up emotion in his heart, the restraint snapped. Silas let out a low groan, his hands tangling in Julian's hair, holding him steady as the kiss deepened. It was messy, emotional, and overwhelming. Julian felt a rush of heat bloom in his chest, completely intoxicated by the taste of him, by the desperate, clinging way Silas held him. There was so much unspoken love, so much apology, and so much relief poured into that single, lingering kiss. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Silas rested his forehead against Julian's, his eyes closed, a small, genuinely peaceful smile playing on his lips for the first time since Julian had met him. "I'll finish it," Silas whispered into the quiet space between them. "Give me only more week. I'll finish dismantling Marcus, I'll clear the threats, and then, no more bodyguards, no more glass cages. We'll go to the cemetery together, I promise." Julian smiled, his fingers gently tracing the collar of Silas's shirt. "Okay, I trust you," and he did. For the first time, he really did. A week later, the news broke across every network in the city. Marcus Thorne had officially been indicted, his assets frozen, his power within the company completely dissolved. The Thorne empire had been completely restructured, with Silas sitting uncontested at the top, having purged the rot from the inside out. But Silas didn't celebrate in the boardroom. That Sunday afternoon, the sky was clear and bright, the sun warming the cool autumn air. Julian stood on a quiet green hill overlooking the city, holding a large bouquet of white lilies. He knelt down carefully, placing the flowers in front of an elegant, simple headstone. Madame Eleanor Thorne, beloved grandmother. Julian traced the engraved letters with his fingertips. "I found my way, Grandma," he whispered, a warm smile spreading across his face. "I thought I was lost, but I was exactly where I needed to be." He felt a familiar, heavy presence step up beside him. Silas was wearing a soft, casual gray sweater, looking more relaxed than Julian had ever seen him. He reached down, offering his hand. Julian took it, letting Silas help him stand up to save his knee the strain. Silas didn't let go of his hand once he was up. Instead, he laced their fingers together tightly, his thumb gently stroking the back of Julian's hand. Silas looked down at the headstone, his expression incredibly soft. "Thank you," Silas murmured quietly to the grave, "for keeping him safe until I could." Julian leaned his head against Silas's shoulder. They stood there in the quiet sunlight, no longer touched by light only in the day and hidden in shadows at night. They were just two people standing together in the open, holding on to a love that had survived the storm. Thank you all so much for listening to today's story. If you enjoyed the emotional tension and the slow burn romance between Silas and Julian, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below on what kind of tropes you want to hear next. And remember, if you want to support my work and get access to exclusive, uncensored content, bonus chapters, and story continuations, head over to the SpicyTimeBL Patreon. The link is right there in the description. I appreciate you all, and I'll see you in the next story.